BBC Bible Mysteries is a short television series which aired on the BBC in 2004. It consisted of 9 episodes, each about an hour long. It is not to be confused with any number of series with similar names, such as Mysteries of the Bible, which aired on A&E during the 1990s. This is BBC Bible Mysteries 2004. I watched this in 2013 when I was living in Cambodia. And if you've ever been in Cambodia, you know that you can get a lot of DVDs very cheap there. Apparently they come from China, but they are readily available in Cambodia. International copyright is not a problem there, or at least was not when I was living there in 2004. So I was able to buy the whole set for like $3. So I decided to check it out, even though I kind of knew it was going to be terrible. And it was, there were some interesting points, but it was not a great series. So if you've watched this channel, you know that I'm a huge Bible history nerd. I grew up in the church. I was fascinated with Bible stories as a kid. I consider myself a skeptic now, but I'm still fascinated by how much historical truth is in the Bible stories and what history and archaeology can tell us about what's true and what's not true. So I really go in for those scholarly deconstructions of the Bible stories. And have reviewed a number of material about that on this YouTube channel before. For example, the Yale history courses on the Old Testament, the Yale Open courses on the Old Testament by Christine Hayes, Truth and Fiction in the Bible, the unauthorized version by Robin Lane Fox, who's a classical historian, and various other things. Lots of books by Bart Ehrman, etc. So, I'm interested in this stuff, but I think, as everybody knows, when it comes to stuff in the Bible, especially stuff that's produced for a popular market, you've got to be careful, because there is really a lot of crap out there, to put it crassly. A lot of stuff that is either too skeptical or too credulous, or goes off on these crazy New Age tangents. This series on the BBC dabbles a little bit in maybe all 3 of those. Nonetheless, there is some interesting stuff in here if you're willing to sort through it. So there's 9 episodes. The first episode is Who Killed Jesus? Then there's Joshua in the Battle of Jericho. Then Joseph in his multicolored coat. The Real Mary Magdalene. David and Goliath. Herod and the Bethlehem Massacre. The Disciples. The Revelation, the End of the World. And Peter the Rock. Now, each of these episodes presents maybe an oversimplified version of its subject material. There's a lot of debate that could be explored in these episodes, which is not. And at the end of each episode, they give the viewer the impression that the subject has been discussed and has been resolved, and papers over any opposing views in a way that can be somewhat frustrating. But I'm reminded of an interview I heard with David Starkey, which was attached to the audiobook of Monarchy he did. David Starkey is a British historian who frequently appears on television in Britain. And in that interview, he said that there's been a shift in the way history has been presented, at least in British television. He said in the old days you used to have different historians with different points of view, and they used to argue it out like it was some sort of debate show or like a crossfire or something like that. And he said audiences tired of that, and they wanted to hear history more as a story. So there was a move to present history as a narrative. Now, whenever you present history as a narrative, you have to pick a point of view and go with it. And you leave out points of view which contradict the chosen narrative that you want to tell. And I wonder if that was the operating principle behind this series. Across the 9 episodes, there's not a lot of ideological consistency, and we'll get into some of that when we talk about this episodes by episode. Some of the episodes actually support the traditional Christian view of the Bible as being historically accurate. And some of the episodes actually come to the conclusion that the Bible stories are not historically accurate. So it's a little bit of an open question who this series is trying to please. The opening episodes were ignoring some of the historical difficulties. The opening episode singular, which was Who Killed Jesus, was ignoring some of the historical problems in the biblical account and just taking the biblical account at face value as if it was a reliable historical document, which must have made the Christians happy who were watching it, even though I'm sure it frustrated some other people. But then the very next episode, Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, ends up concluding that the biblical story of the Battle of Jericho is not historically accurate. So any Christians that you made happy in the first episode are going to be unhappy in the second episode. In fact, just before filming this, I was reviewing some of these episodes by watching them on YouTube. They're not available on YouTube as a complete set, at least not at this time. Over the years, they've popped up on YouTube and then gotten taken off of YouTube. You know how this works. But the Battle of Jericho, somebody left a comment on it saying, What do they mean the Battle of Jericho never happened and was a fictional story? I am done with this series. And I thought, I guess that would be the attitude of a conservative Christian who was watching this. So, so much for making them happy in episode 1. Episode 2, you go against the Bible and then you've lost them. So I don't know who they're trying to make happy with this series, other than that each episode has a point of view and you just have to go with that point of view for that episode. So anyways, let's go through some of these together. Episode 1 is called Who Killed Jesus? And it's about the trial of Jesus as presented in the gospel narratives. Now, historians have occasionally been skeptical about how the trial of Jesus is presented in the Gospels. There's any number of things that you could nitpick. So Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin appears to break any number of Jewish laws. They weren't supposed to do the trial after the sun went down. They were supposed to wait a day from the conviction before the actual sentencing. There was all sorts of procedural errors in that trial as it's described in the Bible, which don't match actual Jewish law. So that's one problem right there. Another potential problem, if you wanted to nitpick it, is that Pontius Pilate, from what little we know of him from other biblical sources, from extra biblical sources, from sources outside of the Bible, appears to not have been a very nice guy. He was a tyrant, a despot. He ordered a couple massacres, and he put down dissent with a very heavy hand. He's presented in the Bible as this sort of bleeding heart liberal who's saying, I couldn't possibly condemn this man to death because he is innocent, and I would never do anything to hurt an innocent man. And it's been suggested that this was a narrative that the early Christians wanted to propagate because they didn't want... In the early days of Christianity, the Romans looked upon Christians with disapproval because Jesus was a condemned criminal who had been condemned to crucifixion by the Roman authorities. So the story of Jesus' trial possibly got rewritten so that it was all the Jews' fault, and Pontius Pilate was just this little helpless puppet who wanted to save Jesus, but he couldn't because the mobs forced him to kill Jesus, even though Pontius Pilate would never have done anything like that, etc. You get the point. Now, that being said, all of this is lost to the mysteries of time. Maybe the Bible account is accurate. Who knows? But these are the kinds of questions you could ask about the biblical account if you wanted to deconstruct it and try and figure out what really happened. They don't do any of that. They don't talk about the contradictions between the trial of Jesus and the different Gospels. They just present parts of the Bible about the trial of Jesus on face value. A little bit of a missed opportunity there. But then, if you thought that was bad, episode 4, The Real Mary Magdalene, is even worse. So this came out in 2004. The Da Vinci Code came out in 2003, and I don't know how much influence the two had on each other. The Da Vinci Code, the novel, came out in 2003. I think there was a lot of that crackpot, new age type stuff going on where there was this hidden truth about Jesus, or it was fashionable to think of the Gnostics, the suppression of different apocryphal material. In terms of real history, scholars put very little credence in any of that stuff. It's just conspiracy crackpots like Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code. Anyways, episode 4, The Real Mary Magdalene, pursues a Dan Brown-style conspiracy theory about how Mary Magdalene's prominent role in Christ's ministry was deliberately left out of the Gospels. The entire basis for this claim is apocryphal material from the 2nd century or later, which any reputable historian should have flagged as completely unreliable. The BBC presented it as credible historical testimony. Episode 9, Peter and the First Church, has the same same error. It also relies heavily on unhistorical apocryphal material from a much later period. Episode 6 is about Herod and the Bethlehem massacre. Now, you might remember this from the Christmas story. The wise men came to Herod to ask to find the king of the Jews because the star told them it was born in Bethlehem. Herod, who considered himself the king of the Jews, did not want any rivals, so he told the wise men to report back to him once they had found the king of the Jews. The wise men were warned in a dream not to report back to King Herod. So in response, King Herod just killed all the babies 2-year-old and under in Bethlehem. And there was this massacre of the infants. According to the story, Jesus and his family escapes to Egypt because they're warned about it by an angel ahead of time. But there's this massacre of babies in Bethlehem, which is terrible. But the problems with this are that we don't have any other historical source for it. So Josephus, a Jewish historian who was writing about these times, doesn't mention it, doesn't seem to be aware of it. Even within the Bible, it's only mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew. Luke also gives an account of Jesus' birth, doesn't mention anything about the Bethlehem massacre. Nowhere else in the Bible is it mentioned. So it's thought by many people to be non-historical, like a later invented tale. So the episode starts off highlighting exactly the problems I just mentioned. And then it goes into a long digression on the life of King Herod. And then by the end of the episode, it gives interview time, space time for Christian apologists to make the case that because Herod was kind of this unstable personality who was known to kill off a lot of his rivals, that the Bethlehem massacre was probably true, because it certainly seems like the kind of thing Herod might have done. And again, as with all of these questions, it's lost to the mysteries of time. Maybe Herod really did it. Maybe there was a Bethlehem massacre. But I think you could equally make the case, maybe not. And the reason that it sounds like something that Herod the Great actually would have done is because that's how historical fiction is written. You take an historical figure and you write something that is in character for them to do. So because Herod the Great's character was widely known at the time that these stories were being written down, it was very easy to imagine that he would have done this because it was in character for him to do. That doesn't mean it really happened. I mean, maybe. But, there's a question mark there that should be left hanging. And instead, by the end of the episode, the editors heavily want you to walk away with the impression that it was probably historical, when the evidence really isn't there. But episode 2, Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, goes in the other direction, where they start off the episode assuming that the biblical story is true. So going through Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, talking about why it would make sense for Joshua to attack the Battle of Jericho, have everybody analyzing the story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, and talk about how in the text all of these things that they were doing make sense for the time. Jericho's a strategic location. Sending the spies in to reconnoiter it makes sense. The story of Rahab the prostitute makes sense because the prostitutes were often the innkeepers or tavern keepers and seemed to know a lot what was going on in the city. They spend a lot of time talking about that. Then they talk about the legend of blowing on the trumpets and the walls falling down, and they talk about how noise warfare has been used in the experiments that's been done on it. But then after kind of spending all that time, maybe about 30 minutes, treating the story as if it was plausibly historical, then they just kind of take an abrupt veer into another direction and get into the archaeological evidence. I'm obviously having trouble talking today. Some days that happens to me. Anyways, archaeological evidence, and conclude that the archaeological evidence indicates it didn't happen. And in fact, that there was no invasion of Canaan at the time that the Bible reports that there was. And that the archaeological evidence indicates that the Israelites were not an invading army, but were a section of the Canaanites which just developed different religious customs and set themselves apart. Now, for whatever or not my opinion is worth, this is something I've heard from multiple other sources. So the Christine Hayes lectures on the Old Testament, the unauthorized version, Truth and Fiction, the Bible by Robin Lane Fox that I mentioned earlier, they also say that historical evidence indicates that there was no invasion of Canaan as depicted in the Bible. So I believe it. And, when the BBC kind of veers off in that direction at the end of this episode, I thought, okay, well, that's right. That's my understanding. That's what the evidence tells us. But if that's where they were going, then why did they waste the first 30 minutes treating the story as if it was historically plausible? I mean, I guess they're wanting to fill up airtime or wanting to lead the listener, the viewer on this journey, but it's really burying the lead here. Just kind of start with your thesis maybe, and then I don't know. It struck me as the first 30 minutes of that episode were just wasting time. On the other hand, episode 3, the episode immediately following, is Joseph and his multicolored coat. Now, Joseph and his multicolored coat, to me, is just obviously folktale or mythology. It is before the historical period of the Bible stories begins. It's before, in the biblical chronology, it sets up the Israelites in Egypt and the Exodus out of Egypt, which all other historical and archaeological evidence indicate never happened. And of course, as we just said, the conquest of Canaan, archaeological evidence indicates that didn't happen. So highly unlikely that Joseph and his multicolored coat is a real historical incident. But this episode spent the whole time just grasping at the flimsiest evidence to try and make some sort of case that there really was a historical Joseph and we really have located his tomb. And it was just completely sabotaging the credibility of this series. But then, I mean, how does that line up with what we just had in the previous episode, right? If we've established that there was no conquest of Canaan and that the Israelites emerged from within Canaan as a group of Canaanites which just separated themselves, then where does the story of Joseph fit into that chronology? So you get the impression that maybe each episode was produced by a separate writer and nobody was looking over to see if those episodes actually linked together or made sense. Although, to be completely fair, at the end of episode 2, the one about the conquest of Canaan, they did end on a note saying it's possible that some group of Israelites had escaped from Egypt and had entered into Canaan and had armed conflict with some of the Canaanite cities. And maybe that's how these legends have developed. That seems to me to be a little bit of a stretch, but again, to be fair, I think that is a respected view inside real serious academia. Christine Hayes mentioned that in her lectures on the Old Testament. So she mentioned that it was a view. So, apparently that is a view. Anyways, episode 5, David and Goliath, was interesting. Now, my impression of the legend of King David, and I'm heavily influenced here by Robin Lane Fox's opinion in the unauthorized version, Truth and Fiction of the Bible. Robin Lane Fox makes the case that the King David was actually a historical figure because the portrayal of his reign in 2 Samuel portrays him as a very flawed figure, and yet he's upheld as this national hero. So the contradictions between the way the Bible wants him to be this national hero and this very flawed portrait of him indicates that perhaps maybe this was a real historical figure and not somebody completely created out of mythology because there were so many human flaws in David. People debate that. That may or may not be convincing, but I thought that was an interesting view. But Robin Lane Fox says that the young David stories, David fighting Goliath, were probably legends added later. And one indication of this is that the Goliath the giant story actually shows up twice in the Bible. At the end of, I believe it's 2 Samuel, there's a Goliath the giant who is described exactly the same way as the giant that David killed, who was killed by one of David's mighty men, not David himself, or one of David's soldiers at any rate. So it looks like perhaps you had this minor hero killing Goliath, and then later that Goliath story got moved over to King David. It's one theory, but it's something that makes sense to me. So the BBC episode David and Goliath, it took the David and Goliath story at face value, which I thought, oh, okay, that's being a little bit too credulous. We could have asked some questions here. But then it went on to look at the rest of the King David story, and it took the text, the biblical text, as true, but then tried to examine what was going on behind the text, and maybe David's reign wasn't as successful as the Bible was implying. For example, it talks about Absalom's rebellion. So, in the Bible, David is portrayed as this beloved king and everybody loves him. But then when Absalom rebels, very quickly, everyone flocks to Absalom. And, David and just a handful of his loyalists are running for their lives. And so, was David really such a popular king? Or behind the biblical story, was there actually a lot more dissatisfaction with David's rule? Those kind of things. I thought that was a very interesting reading of the biblical text, a reinterpretation of the biblical story. So I like that episode. I thought that was interesting. So as you can see, there were things I liked and things I didn't like across the 9 episodes. I don't know who they were trying to please by this series. They were probably trying to please everybody and ended up pleasing nobody by each episode having a different viewpoint. My biggest complaint, though, across all 9 episodes is just the pacing of it. So if you're watching this and you're hoping to get a lot of interesting information very quickly, it's going to frustrate you. It's one of those series where the narrator will say something in a dramatic voice, pose a question, and then there'll be a shot of the desert with the heat coming up, and then there'll be a Middle Eastern song ah la la, kind of in the background, and you're just soaking up the scenery, and you're seeing the palm trees, and then you cut to a city of people kind of walking down to the market, and it's just crammed full with so much filler like that, and it just moves so slowly. You're like, come on, just get to it. Just get to the actual historical information here. But it's a TV show. So they are filling up their runtime with a lot of interesting visuals and a lot of slow moving people and stuff like that. And I guess if you want the facts kind of condensed down and given to you in faster format with more information, read a book or listen to a podcast. You'll get more information more quickly and probably more enjoyably, in my opinion. So that is my take on the BBC Bible Mysteries. If you've seen this series, let me know what you thought about it in the comments down below. Thank you.